Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, the editor of Crux, and your host here on Last Week in the Church. This is the show where we harvest the fruits of the last week of journalism on the Vatican and the global Catholic Church beat, looking for those few precious, sweet fruits that you need to have in your plate this week. Here's what's on the menu. We begin with a war of words. 3 times in the last 10 days, Israel has criticized the way the Vatican has characterized the conflict in Gaza. We'll explain what the Vatican said, what Israel's beef with it was, and what all that might mean. Second, a kiss and a hug. Pope Francis travels to the Italian city of Verona over the weekend, where the official theme was "Where Justice and Peace Shall Kiss," an appropriate motif for the setting of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. But the most iconic moment from this trip probably won't be a kiss, but rather a hug. A hug between a Palestinian and an Israeli man intended to signify solidarity and friendship in the context of the bloody conflict in Gaza. We'll explain what happened in Verona and why it all matters. Third up this week, we've got So Long, Supernatural. The Vatican issues new rules for judging alleged apparitions and other supernatural phenomena, the gist of which is the Vatican will no longer be making determinations as to whether these mystical experiences are actually of a supernatural origin. They'll be making other, theoretically, easier and faster to reach judgments about these things. We'll explain what the new rules are and what their consequences may be, or may not be, as the case may be. Fourth up this week, we've got a fuss over the false. Why the issue of false mysticism, which comes up in the context of alleged mystical experiences, has implications for the prosecution of sexual abuse cases, including that of ex-Jesuit Father Marco Rupnik. But why the Vatican is actually striking a note of caution about all of that. And then finally this week, we've got not ch-ch changes, but ch-ch China. The Vatican today is hosting a major conference on China. Why one speaker at this event is raising some eyebrows. We'll explain who he is and why all that is seen as having significance. So all that and more is waiting for you on this episode of Last Week in the Church. Please do not go anywhere. Do not change that dial, because we will be right back. This is our official Last Week in the Church infomercial, because I come to you with a special offer for all of those would-be Catholic eggheads out there. That is, if you're the kind of person who likes sounding smart, who likes creating the impression that you know things other people don't. That certainly describes me. If that describes you, you're going to want to know about this. Now, I've already spoken about this new app, this new online resource called Magisterium AI. Basically, what it allows you to do is to type in a question like, what does it mean that the Pope is infallible? Or what does the Catholic Church teach about the environment? Or, whatever. And it will give you a short, smart, easily digestible answer based on more than 5,000 official magisterial texts. But recently, these guys have created a new feature on the app. It's called the Scholarly Mode, which draws not just on official texts, but also the best and brightest of Catholic thinkers and theologians over the centuries, from Augustine and Aquinas to more contemporary figures. And we'll also give you a very quick answer about what those folks have had to say about what the Church teaches on various issues. Now, I promise you that if you try this once, you're going to wonder how in God's name you ever lived without it. It's brought to you by our friends at Longbeard. They are the digital marketing and design company that provide the IT backbone for Crux. They provide the same service for a slew of other Catholic organizations and outfits. They're brilliant, and they are creative, and they are tremendous. And I'm kind of out of adjectives at this point, which is saying something because I traffic in adjectives. But I am telling you, these people are the absolute level best. So check it out. This is Magisterium AI, their new scholarly mode. You're going to dig it. Magisterium.com, that is magisterium.com. It comes with my personal guarantee. All right, everybody, happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, May 21st in the year of our Lord 2024. I hope you're experiencing a glorious spring wherever you are. Here in Rome, the weather has been stunning. Over the weekend, my wife and I were actually able to take our two pugs to a local dog park where they frolicked, romped, and cavorted to their heart's content. It was a glorious spring outing. Hope you're having similar experiences wherever you are. We begin this week with a war of words. So, Israel on the Gaza Strip obviously is continuing its hard power campaign, that is the application of military force. But it is also engaged in prosecuting a soft power war, that is a war of words and ideals, against anyone it believes is trafficking in false moral equivalence between terrorism and self-defense, or in anti-Semitic tropes. And one of the fronts upon which this soft power campaign is being waged is with the Vatican. 3 times in the last 10 days alone, Israel has raised public and strong objections to something that has been said by someone connected to the Vatican on the conflict at Gaza. We begin with a May 8th essay that was published by L'Osservatore Romano, that's the Vatican newspaper, and online by Vatican News, the official media platform of the Vatican city-state, written by Jesuit Father David Neuhaus. Father Neuhaus is a professor at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Jerusalem, expert on Catholic-Jewish relations. He was, from 2009 to 2017, he was the parochial vicar for Hebrew-speaking Catholics in Israel, and kind of a long-time stalwart in all things Jewish and Catholic. He was born in South Africa to a German Jewish family and converted to Catholicism as an adult, so he has experience on both sides of this relationship. And in this May 8th essay, Neuhaus took up the issues of anti-Semitism and Zionism. On anti-Semitism, he basically argued that it has been a disaster not just for Jews, but also for Palestinians, because he said that anti-Semitism obviously shaped the context of the Holocaust. It was the Holocaust that created impetus to the creation of a Jewish state in the Middle East, which in turn, he said, led to the Nakba, what Arabs call the catastrophe, which was the forced displacement and exile of Palestinians during the 1948 Israeli War of Independence. On Zionism, Neuhaus argued that Zionism was a reflection of European colonialism and nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that to be critical of Zionism is not the same thing as being anti-Semitic. There were other points in the essay, but those would be, I suppose, the main ones. Israeli ambassador to the Holy See, Raphael Schutz, objected to Neuhaus's essay. He actually approached L'Osservatore Romano, proposing that he write a response. L'Osservatore Romano initially agreed, but later rescinded the offer. More on that in a moment. So Schutz decided to release the text of his reply to certain media outlets here in Rome, including Crux. And the gist of what Schutz had to say was, number one, that the Nakba was not caused by the Holocaust. So the Nakba was actually caused by Arab intransigence, that Arabs rejected the 1947 partition plan of the UN. They launched the 1948 war. Had they been willing to compromise and play ball, he suggested, all of this could have been avoided. As far as Zionism is concerned, he rejected that it has anything to do with colonialism. He said colonialism is a foreign power taking control of an external territory. Zionism was about Jews who are indigenous to the Holy Land, expressing their national aspirations. Okay, then flash forward to May 10th. The Vatican has an event where it brings together about 30 Nobel Peace Prize winners in an event under the aegis of the Fratelli Tutti Foundation. That's a foundation named in honor of Pope Francis's 2020 encyclical on human fraternity. At this event, one of the speakers is a Yemeni woman, a journalist, by the name of Tawakkul Kamaran, who won the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize for her coverage. She's a journalist, her coverage of the Arab Spring. She used her platform at this Vatican event to condemn what she called Israeli ethnic cleansing and genocide in the Gaza Strip. Ambassador Schutz objected to that too, saying it was a propaganda speech full of lies. He said to say that Israel's engaged in ethnic cleansing is Orwellian because Israel is allowing humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip every day. That reaction probably is why L'Osservatore Romano withdrew its offer to publish his response to Neuhaus. Didn't quite say that out loud, but it seems reasonable given the timing to suspect that the controversy meant they simply didn't want to touch it. Now, flash forward again to the 16th of May when Neuhaus has another essay, this time in Civiltà Cattolica, the Jesuit-edited journal that has a kind of semi-official status. It's reviewed by the Secretary of State prior to publication. In this case, he was trying to take the temperature of Jewish-Catholic dialogue in the wake of the conflict in Gaza, basically saying the heart of the matter is that Jews and Israelis insist that they have a privileged, spiritual, biblical, theological claim to the land of Israel, and that while Catholics in the Vatican respect that belief on the part of the Jewish community, they cannot ignore that there is also another people in the same land, i.e. the Palestinians, who have their own legitimate aspirations. Once again, Schutz and other leaders on the Israeli and Jewish side reacted to this essay. There was a lot they didn't like about it. For one thing, Neuhaus quoted Andrea Tornielli, that's the Vatican's editorial director, referring to the Israeli Defense Forces as the Army of Tel Aviv, which, number one, is a kind of catty way of saying the Vatican doesn't recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and number two, inaccurate because the city of Tel Aviv does not have its own military. Okay, so that kind of thing rubbed people the wrong way. More basically, I think the reaction was that if the Vatican is not willing to accept Israel's self-identity as a Jewish state, then that's a bad place to start any kind of relationship or dialogue. Where does this leave us? I think where it leaves us is a clearer sense of the issues that continue to percolate in the Jewish-Catholic relationship. I think the good news, however, is there obviously is a determination on both sides, despite the somewhat mammoth differences that the Gaza conflict has exposed. There is obviously a determination on both sides that this dialogue should continue. We'll see where it goes from here. All right, second up this week, kiss and a hug. The Pope goes to Verona over the weekend, setting of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. He pursues a very ambitious program. This was Saturday. He left Rome about 6 o'clock in the morning to get on a helicopter to take the ride to Verona. Once he got there, he went to a meeting with priests and religious. He then had a big public event with children and young people. He then had an even bigger public event in a stadium in Verona that is usually used for rock concerts and so on. They called it the Arena di Pace, the Peace Arena. It was a big peace rally that was also a wildly overproduced Italian hootenanny in which they had the country's most famous host and one of its most famous rock stars performing on the same stage with the Pope. He then had a meeting. He went to a prison, met with prisoners, had lunch with prisoners, and then celebrated an open-air mass in Verona. Didn't leave until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, getting back to Rome about 5, so he was gone almost 12 hours. And yet, the Pope we saw on Saturday seemed strong, resilient, utterly at the top of his game, enjoying himself, clearly energized by the experience. This despite the fact that he is 87 and a half years old. He is the oldest reigning Pope in 120 years. He's had 3 hospitalizations sitting on the throne of Peter, and on and on. Despite all of that, the Pope we saw this past Saturday with a very demanding schedule was nevertheless seemingly full of energy and with plenty of gas left in the tank. So, footnote on the Papal Health Watch, certainly the evidence of Saturday would suggest that Francis is good to go for a while. In terms of the most iconic moment from this outing, it came during that event in the Rock Arena, the Arena of Peace, in which 2 young men, one an Israeli, the other a Palestinian, they are friends from some time, both of whom have lost family members in the conflict in Gaza. The Israeli had family members living at one of the kibbutz that was attacked on October 7th by Hamas. They were killed. The Palestinian has family members in Gaza who have been killed by Israeli bombs. Despite all of that, their friendship has continued to blossom, and so they came together on the stage in Verona, and they had this sort of long embrace that unfolded to thunderous applause from the crowd there in Verona. And afterwards, Pope Francis said he didn't feel he needed to comment on what people had just seen. He simply wanted them to take it to heart and ask themselves what they could be doing to promote the cause of peace. That undoubtedly is the moment that is going to live in the popular imagination. Just one other footnote I would make. As I said, as an outsider, you would think this is kind of a pastoral moment for the Pope, right? He goes to an Italian city, he meets with young people, he meets with priests and religious, he, meets with people who are interested in peace, and you would think of this as kind of a religious, spiritual thing. If you're in Italy, on the other hand, what you saw was sort of like Oscar night, because that event in the arena in Verona, it was hosted by a guy named Amadeus, who hosts the annual Italian music festival in San Remo. It's the most watched spectacle of the year in Italy. For Americans of a certain age, this is like having Dick Clark or Casey Kasem host a papal event. I mean, in other words, it says, this is pop culture, right? Also, one of the performers at this event was an Italian artist by the name of Luciano Ligabue, who is kind of the Italian Bob Dylan, their most famous singer-songwriter. The hilarious thing that really made the rounds of the Italian media is that Ligabue performed a song which is called Quanto tempo abbiamo, quanto ne rimane? How much time do we have? How much is left? Okay? And while he was singing about time, one of his most famous songs, pouring his heart out, there was a shot of the Pope looking at his watch, like wondering, okay, how much longer is this going to go on? And that shot of Ligabue singing about time while the Pope is checking his watch, that made the rounds, the Italian media. But the point is, for Italians, this was the Pope as pop star, the Pope as the guy who can galvanize and bring together the brightest stars in the pop culture firmament, okay? The other thing is that this event had a clear political relevance as well, because that peace rally was in some ways directed at a center-right Italian government that has been part of the NATO coalition, determined to fund the war, Ukraine in its war with Russia, and also fundamentally supportive of Israel in its war in Gaza. Both of these are controversial positions. There were plenty of people at that event with the Pope on Saturday who have opposing positions on all of this. The Pope was indirectly providing a platform for that opposition, so there was a political edge to it as well. The point is, when the Pope appears in public, it is never entirely simple, and it is never entirely pastoral. There are always cultural and political dimensions to it as well. That's what we saw with the Pope in Verona. All right, third up this week, so long supernatural. So, on Friday, the Vatican staged a high-profile press conference featuring Argentine Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, the prefect of the Vatican's dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, in which new rules were presented for the evaluation of alleged apparitions, especially Marian apparitions, and other purported supernatural and mystical phenomena. In the past, when somebody would claim that Mary was appearing to them in delivering, revelations or crying tears or whatever, there would be an evaluation by local church authorities that would then be kicked up the line to the Vatican, and eventually, and I emphasize here eventually, a ruling might be made as to whether these events were or were not of supernatural origin. That is, whether they were authentic. Okay? Now, the problem is that reaching conclusion about whether a particular phenomenon is actually supernatural turned out that's a really complicated enterprise that was taking a very long time, in some cases decades, in order for a conclusion to be reached. The Vatican, in the meantime, upon reflection, decided that in an effort to exercise quality control, to give the kind of guidance about these things people want, it would be simpler if they would simply sort of prescind from the question of whether this is actually supernatural. Leave that in the hands of God and history, I suppose. And in the meantime, provide a range of simpler, theoretically anyway, simpler options that authority could reach. And there are 6 in these new rules. At the most favorable end, there would be a conclusion of a nihil obstat. That is, there is no objection to devotion to this alleged phenomenon. Bishops would even be able to, priests would even be able to encourage people to participate because there's nothing to object to. That would be the most favorable conclusion. At the least favorable end of the line would be a conclusion that this is not of supernatural origin. And in the middle, there are 4 other options of varying degrees of approval or disapproval. The theory being that it will be simpler, easier for church authorities to reach these conclusions so that, as I say, quality control can be applied more quickly. Is there reason to believe this is actually going to work? Well, we're going to have to see what kind of rulings come out of the Vatican, but let me just point out that one alleged visionary, an Italian woman by the name of Gisella Chiara, who is responsible for devotion to the Madonna of Trevignano. Trevignano is a town about 45 minutes north of Rome. This is a Marian statue that is allegedly crying tears of blood, and Gisella claims that every month there's some fresh revelation that is provided to her. When she has her little gatherings at Trevignano, large numbers of people show up, more than 1,000 often, who are attached to these devotions. In an interview with the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, asked about the Vatican's new rules, she basically said, I don't think this has anything to do with me. I'm not going to stop what I'm doing. And by the way, I'm all for rules, but how about some respect, right? How about some mutual comprehension? So early returns, anyway, would indicate that some of the people who were involved in these alleged mystical phenomena do not appear to feel that these new rules necessarily mean they've got to cool their jets. Let me point out that if you are someone who is attached to one of these alleged phenomena, that the fact that church authorities may not initially be, wildly enthusiastic probably isn't going to mean very much to you because you know the story. The fact that many mystical phenomena that the church today does approve at the beginning were not seen very kindly by authorities. Let's remember, Italians all know Padre Pio was subject to 6 different investigations during his lifetime by the Vatican, by his local bishop, by his Capuchin order. Agostino Gemelli, the founder of the University of the Sacred Heart in Milan, for whom the hospital in Rome, where popes are treated his name, Franciscan priest, one of the most important Catholics of the 20th century, once referred to Padre Pio as an ignorant psychopath who was exploiting the credulity of simple people and who was faking his stigmata. He called him a fraud, openly, publicly. And yet, of course, today, Padre Pio is a saint of the Catholic Church. So, if you are someone who was involved in one of these phenomena and for whom authorities initially appear less than completely supportive, are you necessarily, knowing this history, are you necessarily going to be cowed by that? I would suggest probably not. So, in the long run, what difference are these rules going to make? Remains to be seen. Early returns would suggest, at least for right now, they may not have dramatic consequences on the ground. All right, 4th up this week, we have a fuss over the false. One of the bits of subtext to these new rules from the Vatican is that it raises the question of what is often referred to as false mysticism. That is, the use of alleged mystical concepts or experiences to justify wrongdoing. And this has come up most recently in the context of charges of sexual abuse, abuse of conscience, abuse of authority against the ex-Jesuit, Father Marco Rupnik, now a priest of a diocese in his native Slovenia, who is one of the Catholic Church's most famous contemporary artists, who has also been accused of the serial abuse of adult women, mostly nuns, over roughly a 30-year period. He is right now, allegedly anyway, under investigation by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith because Pope Francis recently lifted the statute of limitations that it would allow a prosecution against him to take place. It has been suggested by some that Rupnik might be guilty of this offense of false mysticism because he often used mystical concepts and mystical vocabulary anyway to explain to these nuns why he was coming on to them and the various things he wanted them to do with him. And some have suggested that the lack of a clear legal concept of false mysticism in the Church's law has been an impediment to prosecuting cases such as Rupnik's. Cardinal Fernandez was asked this question at a Vatican press conference, and in response, he basically said the problem with false mysticism is that it means too many things to too many people. It would not give rise to a clear legal standard, and using it as a basis for prosecution might actually end up being counterproductive because there would just be endless arguments over what it actually means and what would constitute false mysticism under the law. Basically, he said this needs more study. Now look, anybody who understands the psychology and the vocabulary of bureaucracies knows that when someone in charge says something needs more study, that means we're not ready to do anything about it right now. On the other hand, just to be fair to Fernandez, it seemed that his answer didn't mean that he didn't think something should be done about Rupnik. It seemed he simply meant that he wasn't sure that this particular concept would help get where we need to get on the Rupnik case. As ever, we will see how this unfolds. But I think the bottom line here is there continues to be some confusion, uncertainty, and need for clarity about, well, first, this concept of false mysticism, but more importantly, perhaps, what happens when someone in authority invokes spiritual or mystical concepts in order to justify abusive behavior? With what crime will they be charged? And with what process will those charges be prosecuted? That question is in desperate need of an answer, particularly when it comes to the Rupnik case. All right, finally, this week, not changes, to quote David Bowie, but rather China. So today, this very day, as we speak, Tuesday, May 21st, the Vatican is hosting an important conference. Well, the Vatican. Actually, the Pontifical Urban University, which is a Vatican-sponsored university here in Rome. It's generally the university for students from the developing world, including, of course, Asia and China. The Urban University is hosting a conference to mark the 100th anniversary of the Council of Shanghai. This was an ecclesiastical council in China that took place in Shanghai in 1924, obviously before the communist takeover, which, in a sense, kind of regularized the situation of the Catholic Church in China, and most importantly, emphasized that you could be both a good Catholic and also a good, loyal citizen of China. Asserted there was no conflict between those two things. To mark the occasion, the Urban University is hosting a conference co-sponsored by the Vatican's Congregation for Evangelization. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle of the Philippines is speaking at this conference. So is Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State. But what has really raised eyebrows is that also speaking at this conference is Bishop Joseph Shinbin of Shanghai, who was named to that position in April 2023, not by Pope Francis or the Vatican, but rather by the Chinese government in what was widely seen as defiance of China's 2018 deal with the Vatican, which said that bishops would be decided upon collaboratively between Beijing and Rome. In this case, the choice was unilateral. Later, in June of 2023, Pope Francis ratified that decision, so made Shinbin the papally recognized Bishop of Shanghai. But nevertheless, that incident is seen as an example of how this deal that China and the Vatican struck is sometimes more honored in the breach than in the observance. It is up for renewal again in October. It would be the third time it's been renewed provisionally. And undoubtedly, the conference today, Shinbin's presence at it in his story, will be another bone of contention between supporters of this deal who believe it is critically important for the Vatican to be in dialogue with what is inarguably a global superpower, even at the expense of having to make some concessions around the edges, and critics who believe that the Vatican is throwing the baby out with the bathwater and bending over far too backwards in order to accommodate China's communist government. That debate is going to unfold regardless. Today, I suppose, will be another talking point in this long-running conversation. All right, that is our show for this week. Full coverage of all these stories can be found on the Crux site. Again, that is cruxnow.com, your one-stop shopping destination for the very best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. Thanks for tuning in. We will be back here next week, same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, I wish you a fantastic and blessed week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will talk to one another again very, very soon.